So in the last tutorial, while we were building our rubric, I pointed out an additional hyperlink that I told you didn't have to worry about clicking at that point in time, but I want to talk about it now, and that was outcomes. So you'll find outcomes here in your course navigation bar. I'm going to click on it, and that's going to bring me here. So what are outcomes? Well, outcomes are essentially whatever you want them to be, but the long and short of what outcomes are is they're a way to follow and assess student progress throughout your course. So, like I said, they can be whatever you want them to be. You can essentially bring in course standards and integrate them into your outcomes. You can do a variety of different things. And just like everything else in Canvas, you can create them individually, or you can even drag and drop them into groups. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to create a new outcome, and we're going to associate it with one of the rubrics that I had. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new outcome, and we're going to call this data quantification. You can give it a friendly name if you want to. This is going to be the more formal name. I'm going to leave that blank. And I'm going to say this assesses the student's ability to display data in charts, graphs, and tables. Additionally, this outcome determines the student can properly represent data when it is acquired or provided. Okay. So obviously this isn't something I'm going to use, but I'm just building it out as though it were something. Okay. So you then determine the parameters for the mastery of these outcomes. So let's say that I'm going to build this into my lab report. Let's say that part of this is going to be the student making a chart or graph, and I want to make sure that the student can actually develop that chart or graph in there, and it's going to be in the results section, and let's say that's going to make up, I'm going to give the student 5 points if they can properly put their data into a chart or graph. Okay, so 5 is going to exceed expectations. For meets expectations, I can say, okay, that's going to be 3. You'll notice you can actually hover here on insert, or you can just leave as is. So you can change the point values. So if I wanted this to be worth instead 50 points, then I'd say okay, and you'll notice that changes the total points over here. I only want it to be 5 though, so I'm going to leave that as 5. If you click insert, it actually puts in a new parameter. So if I wanted to do something for 4 points instead of 5 points, then I could, but I'm not going to. So I'm going to say, okay, if the student puts in the graph and maybe they don't put a title or something like that, but they do label the X and Y axes, I would give them up to 3 points for that. And that would mean that they have just met the bare minimum. They placed their data in a chart or a graph, they've labeled the axes, but they forgot to put the title in so that people would actually know what they were looking at. The student who does everything I'm expecting, they're going to get 5, and then students who don't do anything, or they choose the wrong graph, leave out the title, leave out the axes, labels, all that, then they're going to probably score below 3 points. Okay, so you define where mastery is going to actually be. Okay, so I could even with this being meets expectations, I could still set my mastery up to 4 if I wanted to. But I'm going to leave it at 3 because that coincides here with what I've got. This is more just for quantification. Okay? Next, you're going to determine how you're going to calculate whether or not the student has successfully met expectations for this whole outcome. So this might be on only one lab report, but what if I give the student 4 lab reports throughout the course of the semester, and the student gets a 1 for this on the first lab report, then a 3 on the second, and then 5s on every lab report after that? Well, that's where you're going to come to the calculation method. So you're given the option for a certain way to calculate student mastery. So you can say, okay, I want to do a decaying average. And the way that the decaying average works is it takes the student's final score on the outcome, and that's going to make up 65% of the student's total score for the outcome. and then the remaining scores the student has before that score are going to be averaged, and that's going to account for 35%. So if I had a student who made a 1 on the first lab report, 3 on the second, and then 3 5s, the final 5 is going to make up 65%, okay? And then the remaining 2 5s, the 3, and the 1 would all be added together, and then they would be averaged. And then I would take that average, which would be 35%, and the 5 the student got on the last quiz, which would be 65%, and that would give me the final score. And that would be what I use on this scale to determine if the student has mastered or at least met the content's minimum standard. Okay? And notice here you can actually set how you want this to be broken up. So if I want this to be 75, then I can. And notice this all changes appropriately based on how I choose to do this decaying average. So that's decaying average. In number of times. This says that the student must achieve mastery of that particular content a certain number of times. So if I wanted it to be where the student had to get a 5 and I wanted him or her to be able to do that at least 2 times, then I could do this. So the student would have to get 2 5s. And once the student gets those 2 5s, he or she has successfully mastered that content. Most recent scores. I could then say, okay, mastery is going to be at 5, and the final score that the student achieves, that's going to determine where he or she falls. And then finally, the highest score. This one, hopefully self-explanatory. Whatever the student winds up making, I take the highest value of all of that, and that would determine if the student successfully mastered the content or not. So I'm going to set this to 3. I am going to do a decaying average, okay? And I'm going to save. So I've created my outcome. And now if I want to, I can build this outcome into my rubric. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back to an assignment. And we're going to go back into Lab Report 3. All right, so let's go back into Lab Report 3. I'm going to go ahead and edit the rubric here. And this is going to be part of the results section. So the results section, I'm now going to only make 15 points. And I am now going to click on Find Outcome. There's my data quantification. I'm going to click on that. It says use this criterion for scoring. Yes. And I'm going to import this. It's going to give me this pop-up window asking if I want to import it, and I'm going to say OK. And so now that outcome has been integrated into the total 100 points of my example rubric. So I would then update the rubric, and now when I grade the student's assignment, these 5 points that would be tied to the graphs that are drawn in here, those are going to record that data as part of that outcome. So if I give 6 lab reports and I include this in every single one, I can monitor student progress in regards to the students putting data and representing that data appropriately in their lab reports. So hopefully you can kind of see that this is going to be a very, very valuable tool in monitoring student progress as students move through a course. Okay, so those are outcomes, and that is ultimately how you can actually implement those outcomes into a rubric.